Today's more of the intro, like here are the basics. A lot of it might be review, especially if you've already done the pre-work or the jump start or the pre-bootcamp work. And then tomorrow is where we'll go a little bit more in depth. Okay, cool. So let's get to it. Intro to arrays. Yeah, we'll cover all of these later on. Okay, so what is an array? An array is a list-like data structure in JavaScript. I think the word list, if you actually think about what it means in normal English, it actually translates very well to what a list is an array. So what are the different features of a list? Well, if I was to make a grocery shopping list, right, or a to-do list, a list or an array has a few key characteristics. The first one is that order matters, right? If I was to create a list of 3 things and I put a 1, 2, 3, then it means I want to preserve that order. And so inherently, whenever you make an array, one of the most important things to make sure that it's capturing what you want to capture is the fact that the elements are put in the correct order. So all of these examples here, lines 3, 5, 7, and 9, are examples of arrays. And for everything inside the array, rather than calling it a thing, we just call it an element in programming. So I would say on line 3, the numbers array has 3 elements, right? On line 5, the names array has 3 elements. Line 7, no array there. And on line 9, that mixed bag array has 5 elements. Notice how basically the beginning of the end of the array is demarcated purely by the open square bracket and the closing square bracket, and every element within the array is separated by a comma. If you remember what I said earlier about the order, let's take line 5, the names array. That's an array. It has 3 elements because it's 3 things separated by 2 commas, and every element in the way I would refer to George in the names array is I would say George is the first element, or it's the element at index 0. John is the second element, or at index 1, and then Thomas is the third element, or at index 2. Because just like strings, the index for an array also begins as 0, and we go on from there. And so the first element is at the 0th index, and so on and so forth. One other thing to notice is that notice on line 9 for the mixed bag array, I have an array of basically 3 or 4 different variable types, right? 30, the first element at index 0, that's a number. The second element is true, which is a boolean. Third element is apples, which is a string. The fourth element is null, which is a null type. And then the fifth element is a variable, which is a string as well. And so once again, the few key things to notice from the array, it begins and ends with the open and closed square brackets. The things inside the arrays are called elements. Every element is separated from each other by a comma, and arrays can hold, practically speaking, as many things as you wanted from as many types as you want to, right? So it's not like an array has to be all strings or all numbers or all one thing. You can actually do a collection of whatever it is that you want. If you remember from last week, one of the things that I told you that we could do for primitive data types in order to figure out what something is, if something's a number or a string or whatever it is to use this type of operator. Remember, once again, the type of is a reserved word in JavaScript, which means that comes built in. However, if I have an array here called names and I do type of names, I actually don't get back array. I get back object. And we'll talk a little bit more about why this is when we talk about the object section. But just know that type of tends to work very, very well only for the primitive data types. Primitive, once again, just means we can't change the value of it. So those are things like booleans, numbers, strings, nulls, undefined, and symbols. For things like arrays, we call them complex data type or non-primitive data types. And the rough rule of thumb is that basically all non-primitive data types in JavaScript are theoretically objects. And that's why when you do type of names, we get back object. However, the point of showing you this is just to let you know that if I want to determine if something is an array, it looks like using type of isn't actually the most helpful thing. Because if I do type of an object, I also get back object. If I do type of an array, I still get back object. So I actually have no way to tell if something is an array or not. So that's where another function you may find handy is this array.isArray function. So just to break it down, notice how the A in array, the first array, is capitalized. What is that, or not? It's hard to ask questions via the portal, but essentially what that means is when the first letter of my variable is capitalized, usually it means I'm referring to a class, right? And in this case, much like how when I was doing coercion, I had a number class and a string class and a Boolean class. Here, the capital A in array basically just symbolizes I'm using the array class. And don't worry about figuring out what the array class is. Just know that the array class is built into JavaScript. So no matter what you use, or rather, no matter what environment you're in, you will always have access to the array class. Okay. And then we had this dot. We'll talk about dot a bit more too when we cover the function in the function section. But just know for now, basically all we're saying is, hey, use the isArray function on the array class. That's what array.isArray is saying. It's saying go to the array class and then find the isArray function and then invoke it. Invoking a function in JavaScript basically means calling a function. You've done it almost every single workshop since we started. It basically says whenever you write a function, if I ask you to call it, you basically take the name of the function, put an open parentheses, put whatever arguments you want into the function, and then put a close parentheses. And that basically is how you call a function. We're doing the same exact thing here, except rather than calling a function that you wrote, we're now calling a built-in function. We're calling a built-in function that's been built into the JavaScript. So in this case on line 3, we're saying is array.isArray. We're basically calling the isArray function. Notice how we have an open parentheses and we feed it in names and then we put in a closed parentheses. And what array.isArray is going to give you is a Boolean value, so which means that it's only ever going to give you one of two possible values, true or false. And hopefully the function name is pretty clear. If you give back true, it means whatever you passed in is an array. If you get back false, it means whatever you passed in is not an array. So here on line 3, if I feed in the names array into array.isArray, I get back true because names is an array. And then if I feed in a string, in this case I am not an array, into array.isArray, I get back false, which basically says whatever I passed in, once again in this case a string, is not an array. So array.isArray is just a more refined, a more accurate way of testing whether or not a particular variable or a particular value is an array or not. So use this if you're trying to test for whether or not something is an array as opposed to type of. So far so good? Cool. All right. Bracket access. Bracket access for arrays works almost identically to two strings. And so because of that, since you've already done a few workshops where you had to kind of go through and manipulate some strings, hopefully this will be a bit of a review for you. But bracket notation basically says if I have an array, if I put an open bracket and followed by and a closed bracket, what that does is it actually allows me to specify an index that I want to access. And so in this case on line 7, what you see there, names, open bracket, 0, close bracket, that basically says give me the element at index 0 of the names array. Remember how once again the indexes all begin at 0. So in English, what line 7 is saying is give me the first element in the names array. Similarly, if I want any other element, all I have to do is specify the index that element is located at. And so 7 gives me George, then John, then Thomas, which all makes sense. On line 13 there, if you notice, I'm accessing array index of 3, which says give me the fourth element in the array. In this case, my array only has 3 elements. So JavaScript, and this is more for you to be aware of, the JavaScript does. JavaScript, rather than throwing an error, it will just give you an undefined, which basically means that this value could potentially exist. We just haven't created it yet, which is technically true. But just so you know, JavaScript won't throw an error if you try to access an element that's kind of outside the range of an array. It would just give you back an undefined value. And so the other thing to note here is undefined. Remember, it's not a string, right? It's its own data type. So if I was to do type of each of these outputs, George, John, Thomas would all return a string, but then undefined would return back type undefined. So that's kind of a quirk of JavaScript that you need to be aware of. assignment. So this basically says, hey, what if I don't want to just know what value it is? What if I want to change it, right? What if I want to replace the first element of my array with something else? That's literally as simple as just using an equal sign and creating a variable like we always have. So in this case, on line 6, what I'm saying is, hey, go to the names array, go to the element as the 0th index, aka the first element, and set it equal to Washington. Do the same for the other two elements as well. And so once I do all of this, if I was to print out names again, I now get back Washington, Adams, and Jefferson. Okay. Notice how when I replace an element in the array, it replaces the element, right? It doesn't it doesn't shoehorn it in there and shift everything else down. Whenever you use the equal sign, it means you are actually replacing or displacing, I guess, the previous value was whatever new value that you want. And so usually that's why before you replace a value, always make sure that you don't need that value anymore. We'll talk more about how to insert values and shift values around tomorrow, and also in one of the later lessons as well. For now, for this workshop, all we're going to talk about is kind of direct replacement, which is just a flat equal sign. Okay. And so here we're going to kind of touch a little bit upon the difference between primitives and non-primitives. If you were on the earlier workshops, what we did was we asked you to go through, I think, a string and capitalize, I believe, every other letter, or kind of something along those lines here. And I'm willing to bet that most of you, what you did is you went through this. If you went through the string, and you actually probably tried capitalizing every other letter, and it probably didn't work, and you probably tearing your hair off for a while trying to figure out like why that happened. And so this kind of harkens back to the primitive versus non-primitive concept we talked about earlier. So primitive, once again, just means an element cannot be changed. And so things like numbers and booleans and strings especially are primitives, which means once I create a string, I am not able to change that string. However, arrays and objects are what we call complex. And what that means is they are able to be changed, which means once I create it, I can actually edit it if I want to. So on line 7, we have an array called an array of 5 elements. Each element is a letter, and the 5 elements are BRACE. And then we create a string called brace as well. Notice how on line 10, I'm trying to replace the first element of the array with a G, and I try to replace the first character in the string with G as well. However, when I print out both elements, you'll notice how in the array, because arrays are changeable, the first element, that B, it actually got replaced with a G. But for the string, nothing happened, or at least the B did not get replaced with a G, because remember, I cannot change a string once I create it. The only way to create, let's say, a grace string will be to construct a new string completely from scratch. Okay, so this is probably the best example I can give you of what primitive versus non-primitive means. In one instance, after you create it, so for the non-primitives, after you create it, you are able to go back and change elements within it. For the primitives, once you create it, that's it. You can never change it ever again. If you need another version of that, then you need to create a brand new version or a brand new variable. Cool. This makes sense as well.
You said array and something else could be changed?
Arrays and objects. Yeah, we'll do like another 2-day session on objects. I think actually Wednesday and Friday of this week. So we'll definitely, or sorry, Wednesday and Thursday of this week. So we'll definitely talk about that too. Cool. All right. So now we're going to teach you, or we're going to walk you through, I guess, a few kind of things that we can use arrays for that are pretty handy. And so as a quick, actually, I'll make the caveat later tonight. Or sorry, not later tonight, but later before you start the workshop. Okay. So let's talk about properties. Properties and methods are things that we're going to cover more in depth when we talk more about functions. But essentially, what we're trying to tell you now is whenever you use an array, there are things that arrays kind of come built in with that are really helpful and really handy that make your life a lot easier. So something like the dot length property. If I have an array and I ever wanted to know how long that is, I would just do arrays dot length, or in this case, names dot length. Whenever you have an array, it comes included with dot length. I won't go into the details too much of kind of how that works behind those scenes, but just remember how how like the array class has a dot is array function kind of built into it. In that same vein, all arrays have the dot length property built into it too. So whenever I create an array with the open and closed square brackets, I'm inherently creating something that has a dot length property. So I don't need to create my own version of dot length. It comes included. So here when I do names.length, I get back 3, right? So, and also just something to be aware of that's sometimes a little bit tricky and it trips people up is indexes start at 0. So an array of length 3 has index 0, 1, and 2. But length is actually just how you and I would think about normal length, right? It starts at 1. So in this case, there are 3 elements here. Okay, so that's one thing that comes built into arrays, the dot length property. Another thing that comes built into arrays are a bunch of methods or functions that you can call. The reason why we call them methods and not properties is because properties are inherently kind of we call like more static values, whereas methods are kind of functions that usually require you to have some kind of input. So the dot push method. What the dot push method does is the dot push method allows you to add one or more elements only to the end of the array. But what it returns is the new length of the array after the new elements have been added. So here, let's say I have an array called names with 3 elements, George, John, and Thomas. If I do names.push James on line 6 there, what that's going to do is that's going to console log out, or that's going to change the names array to now include 4 names. And remember how push adds it to the very end. So here when I add in James, I'm adding it as the very last element in the array. Now, what does that function, what does .push return? It returns back the new length of the array. So on line 6, when I invoke names.push, I'm actually capturing the output value in this variable called new length. So when I console log out new length on line 9, I get back 4. So once again, this is just to show you that names.push, it fundamentally changes the original array. Whenever I teach this section, one of the things I always ask people to kind of consider or just think about is there's basically 3 parts to all these methods. The first one is what is it doing? The second thing is it doing it to the original array or is it creating a new array? And then the third consideration is what does it return? So for this function, what it's doing is it's adding one or more elements, and we'll talk about how to add multiple elements next slide, but it's basically adding one or more elements to the end of the array. It is modifying the original array. And lastly, it returns back the length of the new array. So, and if I wanted to add in more things, let's say I want to add in James, and then David, and then Mike, I would just do names.push, and within the parentheses, I would feed in James as the first argument, comma Mike as the second argument, comma David as the third argument, and I'll just take James, Mike, and David and shove them onto the end of the array. Okay, so that's .push. It just adds it to the end of the original array. That's all .push is doing. And then we can contrast that with the next method we're talking about here, which is .pop. Whereas push adds one or more elements to the end of the array, what .pop does is .pop actually removes the last element from the array. So question number 1, what is it doing? .pop removes the last element from the original array. The point number 2 is it doing it to the original array or a copy of the array? In this case, it's actually doing it to the original array. And question 3, what is it returning? It's actually returning to us the element that it just removed. So that way on line 6 there, if I do let Jefferson equals names.pop, not only am I removing Thomas from the names array, but I'm actually capturing Thomas in this variable called Jefferson that if I want to use it, I can use it later on. Okay, so once again, what is it doing? It's removing the last So dot pop only removes a single element from the end of the array, whereas dot push can add multiple. So just kind of keep that in mind. And dot pop also takes no arguments. So whenever you use dot pop, there's only one way to use it and one thing it does, which is to remove the last element in the array. So once again, dot pop removes the last element in the array. It modifies the original array, and it returns back the element that you just asked it to remove. And all of these slides will be up as well. So like I'm less concerned about you kind of memorizing it now. But when you do your workshop, feel free to have these kind of pulled up next to you so you can read them and make sure you understand kind of how to use them. Dot shift is also just like dot pop, except instead of removing the very last element in the array, it actually removes the first element in the array. So it works almost identical to dot pop in that regard, right? Notice how dot shift, when I call the function there on line 8, it takes in no arguments, right? It's just dot shift open and close parentheses. It removes the first element in the array, and then it returns back the element that just got removed. So almost identical to dot pop. The only difference is when I do a dot pop, I'm removing it from the end of the array, so nothing else in the array gets impacted. When I use dot shift, I'm actually removing the first thing in the array, so all the other elements in the array shifts up one. Right, so it's like if I was if there was 10 people in line and the first person goes away, well, everyone's position now kind of goes up by one, right? Like the second person is now first, and the 10th person is now ninth. And so the same idea applies here. So once again, what does it do? It removes the first element in the array and shifts all the other elements up one position-wise. Is it modifying the original array, or is it creating a copy? In this case, dot shift is modifying the original array. And then lastly, what does it return? It returns back whatever element just got removed. And then to kind of complete this quadrant, sorry, there might be a question, but let me just do dot unshift first, and then I'll take questions on these four because they kind of go hand in hand in some ways. Dot unshift is just like dot push, except now what we're doing is we're actually adding one or more elements to the beginning of the array. And obviously, if we add things to the beginning of the array, then it also shifts everything else down position-wise, right? It's like if you have a line of five people and then 3 people got ushered to the front of the line, well, the person who was 5th is now 8th, right? And so on and so forth. And also, just like dot push, it also returns back the new length of the array after all the new things have been added. Okay, cool. So those are the 4: dot push, dot pop, dot shift, and dot unshift. And then tomorrow we'll talk more about how to add or remove things from the middle of the array as opposed to only the beginning or the end. Okay, was there a question? Sorry, I think someone had a question earlier.
Yeah, I had a question about how, Charlie, about
Yep.
calling the different methods.
Yep.
Do we need to define like a new variable the way that in the unshift one it's new length equals names dot unshift, or could line 5 just be names dot unshift?
Yeah, so if you don't care about the return value, you can definitely just do names dot unshift. If you want to capture the value that the function is returning, then you need to capture that in a variable. So in this case, if I just want to add King George III to the beginning of my array, I don't care about what the new length of it is. I can totally just do kind of names dot unshift King George the third a la carte, if you will, on line 5. Yeah, good question. Any other questions on these four array methods? Cool. All right, there's a few more here we're going to go through, and then we'll be wrapping up for today. So another method to talk about is .index of. It works the same way as a string .index of. What it basically does is you can just think of it as a glorified search function. In this case, what .index of is you pass it a value. In this case, we're passing it a string, and it will just tell us, hey, at which index does that element appear? If it finds it, then it will give you the index that the element appears at. And if it does not find it, it gives you back -1, which basically means, hey, there were no matches here. A few caveats to know. So what does this do? This looks for the element that you provided. It tries to find an exact match. does it modify the original array? It doesn't change or create a new array. It just searches the original array. So it doesn't mutate or modify any of any arrays. And then what does it return? It returns back a number. If the number is 0 or greater, it means it found the match, and then that number is the index of the match. If it returns -1, then it means it didn't find any matches at all. The other thing to consider here is it will give you back the first match it finds going from left to right. And so if you have multiple matches in your array, it will still only give you the index of the first match it finds going from left to right. Right. So if my array is George, John, Thomas, George, and I search for George, it's only going to give me the first George it finds, which is at index 0. So the one at index 3, it might be there, but as far as JavaScript or index of is concerned, it doesn't care. It found at least one match, so that's what it gives back to you. Okay, and then the next method is the .slice method. .slice method is also very similar to the comparable string method as well. .slice takes in 2 arguments. The first argument is basically, so what .slice does. .slice basically allows you to create a copy. It basically lets you copy a subset or a portion of an array. So, and copy is really valuable because basically this means I'm creating a brand new array. Okay, so here, and what the 2 arguments that slice takes in. The first argument is what index you wanted to start copying at, and that's inclusive. And the second argument is what index you wanted to stop copying at, and that's exclusive. So the way to think about that is on line 6 there, when I do names.slice and I pass in 1, 2, what that says is, hey, create a new array for me, and put in that new array the elements going from index 1 in names all the way until you get to index 2 in the names, but don't include the actual element at index 2. So it includes index 1, but it does not include index 2. Okay, and in this case it stores all of that in this variable called one-term precedence. So on line 8, when I console log out one-term precedence, I have an array, right? I have an array because I'm creating a copy of an array, and the only element in that array is the element at index 1, but it stops before I get into index 2. So in this case, that's just one element at index 1. In this case, which is just John. And then once again, if I look at the original names array, remember how I'm creating a copy of the original array, and so therefore I'm not changing the original arrays at all. Okay, so just going through that 3-step framework again. Step 1, what does it do? It creates a copy of the original array. It creates a copy of a portion of the original array by taking in 2 arguments. The first argument tells it where to start and includes that element, and the second argument tells it where to stop, but it stops before it includes that element. Step 2 is, does this change the original array or does it create a new array? In this case, we are creating a brand new array, and so in this case, we have to store that value in a new variable. And then lastly is, what does it return? It returns back the new array that we just created. So Charlie, to kind of put your earlier question in context, here if I just do names.slice without storing the variable somewhere, then that's kind of useless because basically I'm creating a new variable that returns a new array that I don't capture or I store anywhere, and so there's essentially no point in me doing it. Cool, that's .slice. And then a shortcut for .slice is to, if you call .slice and you just do it in open and close parentheses with no arguments, by default that just means give me a copy of the entire array, right? Copy everything rather than having making write from index 0 all the way to array.length, leaving a blank just basically says give me a copy of the entire array. And then once again, just to kind of harp on this point, notice how on line 8 I changed the third element of names copy to Paul, and then I added Ringo at the very end. And when I console.log out names and names copy, you see those changes being made, right? You see us having Paul as a third element and adding Ringo as a fourth element. But notice how for the original function, for the original names, nothing changes, right? Like everything's the exact same. And once again, that's because we made a copy of the original array. We never changed the original array. we should put the slides before the previous one. That includes, it's just like a more simplified number search function, honestly. It looks almost identical to .index of, except rather than telling you where it finds it, it just returns back a true or false, as in, does this exist, yes or no? Right, so that includes also goes from left to right, and it only and it just tells you if there's any matches, right? So if you have 6 matches, if you use that includes, it will look the same as if you're looking for something with only 1 match. Yeah. So whereas that index of gives you back the index, that if it finds it, that include just gives you back a true or false or a boolean if you find it. So it's like a more simplified version of that index of. And then lastly, this one, dot reverse. This changes the original array. So what it does, as the name indicates, it literally just reverses the original array. Because it changes the original array. Notice how on line 6 there, I can call names.reverse kind of by itself without having to store anything. I actually don't even know if it returns any value. It might just return undefined. I'm actually not sure, but yeah, that's all it does. It just reverses the original array. And that's pretty much it for arrays, day 1. Tomorrow we'll go into some more complex array functions. But any questions so far?
I had a question.
Yep.
Can you go back to the dot slice?
Sure.
Line?
Yep.
I think it was the previous one.
This one?
Yeah.
Yep.
So the argument 1 and 2 returns John, right?
Yep.
Okay. You know what? I actually thought John was the first.
Okay,
I
cool.
was gonna say, shouldn't it be 0? Yeah, I got confused. So
Yep.
when you're when you're putting in the argument, it would start from 0.
Right. Those are index values.
Yeah. Okay.
Yep.
Yeah. Never mind then. I saw that wrong.
Cool. Okay. So here's a list of everything we talked about today. Any more questions? Great. I will get you paired up or grouped up and then into the workshops. One thing to note for today's workshop, one thing to note for today's workshops. A lot of times we may be asking you to build something that essentially just reuses. That asks you to kind of rebuild the function from scratch because we want you to actually understand how it works and how to do it. So what that means is please don't use the function in your solution. Like if we ask you to say hey, build your own reverse function, please don't write a function that just uses reverse. Right? If we want to ask you to build an index of function, don't just build a function that uses index of. Like that defeats the purpose. We want you to build it by yourself from scratch. Okay? So with that in mind, I will break up into groups, but definitely feel free to ask if you have any more questions around kind of like what's in the spirit.